What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as tools for personal and community growth.
This week, we are reading The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, part 1 of the Broken Earth fantasy series about a volatile planet rocked by constant earthquakes and the oppressed peoples who manipulate stone who live there. Also, I just realized I put a pun in there. I said rocked by constant earthquakes.
That's great. I love it.
Look at me go!
If that synopsis sounds a little vague, know that we really can't get more serious because there are major spoilers ahead.
Yeah.
So, proceed at your own risk. You have been warned. Major spoilers ahead. Okay, if you are still listening, you have agreed to have this book spoiled if you haven't read it already.
It has now fallen on me to shamelessly promote our show. So if you like our show, first things first, rate, review, subscribe, all the things that all the YouTubers tell you to do. Next thing, in the show notes, anytime we link to a book, that links to our bookshop.org affiliate page. And if you buy from that page, from one of those links, we get a very small kickback and it helps us buy more books. And then if you're really on board and you want to get way more involved, you can join our Buy Me a Coffee page at buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv and help us recommend books, have events with us, giveaways. Mostly it's like hanging out with us and reading, writing, and updates about our lives. Potentially we'll do some reviews of TV shows and stuff, adaptations and things.
Oh, she's putting it out in the universe.
Also email us. I've been really inspired recently. You can email us at jvbookclub@gmail.com. Yes, it's different from our handle. It was poor planning. We would love to get emails from you and talk about them. We might share them on the show if you don't mind, or that we can just talk about books with you. That's really all we want to do ever. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for joining.
So the book we're reading, The Fifth Season, was actually recommended by one of our book club members. So you too, dear listener, can help choose books for the pod by becoming a member. So The Fifth Season was really, I felt very immersive for me as a reader, and I rarely could read less than 60 pages at a time because I was just so drawn into the world and learning about the stillness and the origins and all these other terms. I read the last third of the book in literally one sitting.
Oh my
It was
God.
a beautiful Sunday afternoon. I was just sat on my bed and did not get up for hours as I finished the rest of the book. But yeah, overall, my experience reading was really solid, and I'm looking forward to chatting about our takeaways.
Yeah. It's been a weird journey with this book because I was really excited to read it, and then special interest kind of took over my life in all my free time, and I looked up one day and I was like, oh, I have 5 days left to finish this book. And then I got a migraine that lasted multiple days, and I was like, well, shit, my eyes can't focus on anything. So literally I spent the last 2 days of my life in the dark listening to this book as an audiobook, which was extremely good, by the way. Huge fan of the audiobook reader, Robin Miles. Shout out to her. She's the real MVP. Yeah, just laying in the dark, taking water breaks, listening to this book, and I recently emerged feeling slightly better, but I'm really excited to talk about it. It was actually kind of nice. It was a little vacation. I was, in pain.
Quite the vacation.
Yeah. I did realize, though, as I was reading it, that I'd never read any truly adult fantasy series before. As soon as the polyamory negotiations started, I was like, yeah, this is new. This is new. I'd only gotten as far as young adult fantasy series and took a long break, I think, for a lot of reasons that I have not fully explored, shame about my interests. Also, the covers I find very intimidating because they're like close-up pictures of stuff with tons of detail, and they just feel very overwhelming looking at them in bookstores instead of like, I feel like YA series are more like graphic art.
Yeah, this is like a sidetrack, but I think that's a really good point. I also feel very intimidated by fantasy and in some other like genre books as well because the covers feel so busy.
Yeah.
Like it's like kind of hard to read. Like even though the fifth season, like I like the stone detail. It doesn't give anything away about the book because you don't want to give anything away, but like it's a very textured, multicolored background with like kind of thin serif font. I feel like, yeah, I agree.
They're really busy. And they just, so it just felt really stressful to look at them and to try and pick something. Whereas like I knew the YA section of Barnes & Noble and I knew the authors already and the covers were more accessible. And so I would just kind of live there. And then I felt like, oh, well, I'm supposed to be reading real fiction, so I took a detour for a while. But yeah, this book, obviously the sexual component, and then it's like really dark. There was a point where I wrote in my notes like, man, this is dark. Holy shit. That was just like my note for one of the chapters. But fantasy is still my safe space and it felt like coming home. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Kind of a wild ride, but we made it.
So one of the reasons I was excited to read this book, not only was it recommended to me, but I also had heard of N.K. Jemisin. Because of her incredible track record, she won 3 Best Novel Hugos in a row, which is like a record.
Oh my God.
And for all 3 of the books in the series, like the whole trilogy won awards. Yeah. And so I was like familiar with the name, and she's a female writer of color in the fantasy space, which you don't see as many in like a predominantly like white male genre. A little bit about N.K. Jemisin. She is a New York Times bestselling author of speculative fiction, short stories, and novels, and lives and writes in Brooklyn, New York. In 2018, like I mentioned, she was the first author to win 3 Best Novel Hugos in a row. She's also won a Nebula Award, 2 Locus Awards, and she's been a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. Which, those are just big fancy words to say people think she's great and give her money and accolades to do more great things in the world. In addition to writing, she has been a counseling psychologist and educator. She enjoys hiking and biking and is a political/feminist/anti-racist blogger. One thing I thought was particularly interesting is that after the publication of the 5th season, she launched a Patreon campaign basically to like make writing her full-time career. Because at that point she was still working her day job as a psychologist and writing. She was writing award-winning books. Like this is just like a good insight into the publishing world. Like you can be a huge author or an emerging author and not be making enough money to like make rent, especially when she's living in a place like Brooklyn. So in May of 2016, she turned to Patreon, and her loyal fans, like within days, she was able to quit her job and like live off of the support of her fans on top of her revenue she makes as an author. So yeah, that's just a little bit of background on N.K. Jemisin. And since she's written this book, she's written so many more. This wasn't even her first series. This was just like the one that like started winning a bunch of the awards and kind of when she blew up as an author. I think if you look as of 2022, this is like very snugly in the middle of her publications.
Okay. I feel like my job as the summarizer is slowly getting harder and harder the more genre fiction we do.
I think we're just like challenging you. Like that's what I've been unknowing to either of us. That's been my goal all season, is just to make it harder and harder for you to do the summary. And I make it easier and easier on myself with the author bio because I'm just like, here's 3 things from their website. I'm done. I did not stalk their entire Ask Me Anything Reddit thread like I have in the past for other authors.
Oh my God. So this book is about a planet that is defined by constant earthquakes. And there's this former empire called Sansa, not like Sansa Stark, Sansa with a Z, which has figured out a way to enslave this group of people who can use like kinetic energy from the area around them to like manipulate the earth. And they're called Origins, according to the audiobook narrator.
Oh, that's okay. There's a lot of words that I'm going to turn to you for pronunciation because you heard the actual audiobook version versus in my mind. I'm like, origin.
Yeah, it looks like jeans, but she pronounces it like origins. So they're called Origins, and they're not earthbenders, but every single time I imagined them moving the earth, I just imagined earthbending. So thanks, Avatar. Basically, this empire figured out a way to enslave these people and manipulate them and use them, essentially, to keep their planet relatively livable. So to calm the smaller earthquakes. However, every so often, there's such a big volcanic eruption or earthquake that, like, the whole planet gets kind of dissolved into chaos, and all of society is reshaped in the process. And this is called a fifth season, or just a season, hence the title of the book. And it's just like when a big disaster happened and it took a while for things to go back to normal. One of the origins in the prologue causes a giant fracture right down the center of the continent. So they have kind of like a Pangea type continent where everything's kind of mushed together. Because he hates the people who enslaved him so much, and he puts that fault line right through the center of the like heart of that empire, which is called Humanus. And then everything changes. That's the setup. So then our protagonist is a woman with many names. We don't realize that all these people are the same person, but they actually are. So as a child, she's called Demaya. As a trained origin, she's called Cyanite. And then as an exiled mother, called Essun. And so in each sort of period of her life gets its own storyline. And the present, so to speak, is when she's called Essun. And it starts when her husband, who didn't know that she was in origin, she was kind of in hiding, and they had kids together. And her husband finds out that her son is in origin as well, and he kills their son. And so Essun comes home and finds her son dead and her husband and their daughter gone. And so she goes on a journey to try and find them and figure out how to survive in this new season. As Demaya, she's like a kid. She discovers she's in origin, and she's taken to the capital of like the empire by an abusive handler or guardian called Shafa. She's taken to Humanus to be trained to sort of manage the earth while under their control, right? And everything about her life is controlled. And then as Cyanite, she's a grown woman at this point. I assume like in her 20s is what it seems like. She's given an assignment to clear out a coral reef at one of the coastal cities with one of the highest ranked origins, and his name is Alabaster. That's the cover story, but really they're going there to have some alone time so that they can breed like a super baby who would also then be under the control of this empire, which they're not happy about. However, Alabaster is very traumatized and jaded because he's been around for a long time. And so he kind of he opens Cyanite's eyes in a lot of ways and shows her all the grotesque secrets of how the world really works. And they end up becoming a good team. They bicker a lot, which is a fun dynamic, but they end up becoming a good team and like a family. So they do have a kid together. Learning how to harness the power of these mysterious obelisks in the sky. It's kind of as weird as it sounds until everything goes wrong and they've like built a life for themselves in exile, and then it all gets blown to shit. And she ends up having to kill their child so that their child isn't taken to be used by the empire. And they're separated and neither of them knows if the other person is alive. So then Alabaster, he's the one who ends up fracturing the continent and starting this season. And he has this whole bigger plan that is kind of hinted at the end. And they're reunited at the very, very end. He's like dying. Cyanite / Essun, he like needs her to do something, but we don't know what it is yet. So we're left on kind of a cliffhanger, and we immediately want to start book 2. Whew.
That was good. So in this discussion portion of our episode, Julia is basically going to walk alongside me to talk through some elements of fantasy. Julia is an experienced fantasy reader. I have taken probably an even longer break from fantasy than Julia has. I read like the greatest hits of like young adult fantasy back when I was like probably like 14, 15 years old and just devouring every book in sight. But it's been a while since I've been in this world. And like you mentioned in your experience reading, neither of us have spent really any time reading adult fantasy, and kind of the heightened stakes and darkness and other themes that come through for adult readers that we find really fascinating may not be appropriate for younger audiences.
Yeah.
So the three elements we want to talk about. First is narrative strategy and how Jemisin creates mystery throughout her approach towards writing this book. And then we're going to talk about world building, which key to fantasy, sci-fi, like how do we understand this completely new planet? And then lastly, we're going to talk about some of the themes that connect us to the characters. So when a fantasy writer is creating this magnificent world and these characters who have completely different abilities and experiences than we do as human readers on this planet called Earth, there's still something that we connect with, and that's what makes the story so good, right? So we'll be talking about the specific theme of trauma and oppression that Jemisin explores.
Yeah, just a light conversation. Okay, so narrative strategy. The narrative strategy choices for fantasy are super important because, they're making all these choices of like, who is your narrator going to be? What pronouns are you going to use? What perspective are you going to use? What tense, verb tense are you going to use? Like all these kind of things, because you're bringing a reader into a totally new place that they've never been before, that might have some touch points with the world that they're used to, but hopefully it'll be quite different. And so you want to sort of put them in a new set of eyes, in a way, and have them try out a new perspective on things. And it also creates a sense of mystery, right? Because you're like, well, who's the one telling me the story? Are they reliable? Like, when is this taking place? Where is this taking place? So you start a fantasy series with all these questions and these mysteries, just kind of inherent to the genre, especially for a book one of a series. Yeah, and I think we both really liked the narrative choices that Jemisin made.
Yeah. So this like concept of like show don't tell is like the almost cliche advice you get when writing, but it's like so important that you show the reader what's happening, not just telling them. And so when you're creating this whole new fantasy world and these new characters, every novelist has to, confront how they're going to show things, not just tell the reader why things are the way they are. But I think it's more difficult in the fantasy setting because obviously these characters, if they're talking to each other, you don't want like some easy, totally outside character who's like, tell me about how this works. And then someone goes on a long monologue for a long time to explain the science behind something. Like that's not engaging. And so I think Jemisin did an incredible job at introducing us to these characters in this world in a way that there was always that sense of mystery and like what actually is happening here, but I had enough to grab onto that I wasn't like lost for chapters at a time of like, who the heck is this person?
It's a really important balance.
One of the ways that she did this so well is because we have these three storylines and the mystery is we don't know that these people are connected. Yeah. And so they give us different perspectives. So we have Essen in real time is experiencing the onset of a fifth season. And so through Essen's point of view, we get little mentions of what stone lore is, which is basically their oral tradition and their written tradition of history. And we can hear from Essen and talking with other people like, okay, now it's time to like batten down the hatches because we only have so many supplies for our community, and like ash is going to start falling from the sky. It's not bad enough yet to wear masks, which like reading this post-pandemic, I'm like, oh my gosh, the masks. But yeah, they have like ash falling from the sky that blocks out the sun. So you can experience those things in real time. And with the character, and you start to understand what the heck a fifth season is, which is very crucial to the book. Mm-hmm. Through Demea's point of view, she's new because she's a child as an origin. And so her guardian, we learn how the guardians teach the origins.
And it is not pretty.
Yeah. And then Cyanite, who's grown up in the Fulcrum and doesn't yet really question anything, being exposed to new experiences to then question those things that we later piece it together that Cyanite is Demaya, who that was her worldview that she was taught as a child, and Alabaster helps her break it apart and see something new. And I just think it's phenomenal to have this single character who's learning a lot. And as a reader, because the timeline's all jumbled, we get to learn along with all three of them and then piece it together at the end.
That's a really good point. Like something new. There's like the storylines are all defined by something new, some kind of catalyst, some kind of change. And those are the points where we meet, where we enter her timeline in three different places. Mm-hmm. So there's the fifth season starts, that's something new. There's when Demaya finds out she's an origin, that's something new. And then when Cyanite meets Alabaster and starts uncovering all these mysteries about their world and their politics. So yeah, there's like it's like three different catalyst moments. But it's so interesting to like, it's the same woman with three different names, three different points in her life. She so essentially she renames herself every single time she goes through some kind of, at the end of each change. So like at the end of the Demaya stories, she changes her name. And at the end of the Cyanite stories, she changes her name. And then at the end of the Essen storyline, there's kind of a hint that she has some kind of secret name that she doesn't know yet. And so there's, like, every single time there's kind of a fracture or a break in her life. It's a really profound thing, but it's interesting because it's also a mystery, right? So you don't know right away what you're reading. It reads like 3 different people, 3 different storylines, 3 different things. So how did you experience that as you were going through the book?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not the most observant reader sometimes when it comes to like foreshadowing. It literally was like a chapter before it's revealed that Demaya is young Cyanite. Did it click for me? There was like probably the 5th foreshadowing sentence that Cyanite is older Demaya, and it finally clicked for me. It's when Cyanite they're talking about the Guardians, her and Alabaster, and she looks at her hand and she remembers the pain.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, I don't think that's something that every Guardian did to all of them. Like, I think this is Demaya. I think Guardian probably had their own approach. And then, even then, when those 2 were like lined up as the same person, it took me another chapter or so to, like, I was uncertain. I'm like, oh, Essen might be the same person. But I also had at that point realized Demaya and Cyanite's timelines were way earlier than Essen's. So I thought Essen could perhaps be a child, like a descendant.
Oh, you weren't sure the time gap.
I wasn't sure the timing yet.
Yeah.
And then it clicked very clearly, especially when they explicitly tell you. But yeah, it was a little slow for me, though. I will say I had very strong inklings when we first met Alabaster that he had something to do with starting the 5th season. And I was like 95% sure it was him when we were introduced to the fact that he has a stone eater that watches over him.
Yeah.
Because then I was like, oh, in the prologue, there was a stone eater talking to a man who's very powerful. It's got to be him. So I felt pretty proud of myself on that one, gotta say. But what was it for you? Did it feel like a huge reveal?
No, I figured it out pretty early. It is interesting though. I was more sure it was similar for me where I was more sure that Alabaster was the guy at the beginning. I was sure about that first. I was like, oh, this is him. Because, like, they don't introduce you to any other super powerful people.
Right.
And so you're like, oh, well, it must be him. And the way he kind of laughs at his pain and, like, his ideologies seem to and I was like, it seems like this guy could do that. But yeah, so it might just come from, like, I know how fantasy elements go, or, like, I know at a certain point in a book when they've introduced you to all the elements that are going to be in play. And usually like a third of the way through, you're like, these are all the pieces. And they're all going to fit together in a way that maybe you don't expect. So it was pretty early on for me. But it was kind of an accident because I could not wrap my head around when each of the storylines was taking place. And it was really bugging me.
It's like very specifically not mentioned.
Yes! And when we first met Demaya, I was like, oh, we're going to get the story of another person, another perspective, another place, so we can see how everyone around this world is impacted by this new season, right? I thought that was the strategy. And then the Guardian says that he's taking her to Humanus. I was like, that's the city that was just exploded. That city does not exist. So, and their clouds are, like, the sky is not full of ash. Like, it seems like this is not happening at the same time. And then same thing with Cyanite. She was also coming from Humanus. And so I was like, okay, these are not happening at the same time. The Demaya and Cyanite storylines seem to be pre-5th season. Like, I was trying to arrange the timelines in my head and it just wasn't working. And I was, like, so frustrated with it. And I couldn't make sense of it. And so it made it hard to, like, move on. The first thing that clicked was I was like, oh, none of these are happening in the same time or place or same period of life for a woman, right? So there's a child, there's a young woman, and there's a middle-aged woman. So there's absolutely zero overlap for any of these storylines. And I was like, oh, okay. And then it clicked. I was like, we know that Essen has a mysterious past that she won't talk about, that she's, like, hiding from. And it seemed like Cyanite was not her original name because everyone in her world had some kind of stone name. And it's mentioned that she was like a feral is what they call them. So she wasn't born in Humanus. She was, like, brought in. And I was like, okay, so they probably changed her name and gave her, like, a slave name, essentially. If they all are named after different types of stone, So that could very easily have been changed. And then I was like, wait a second. Are these all the same person? That would be crazy. And then I kept reading, and it was confirmed for me because there was, after the first interlude, there's this part where the narrator says, like, you've changed who you are before. You can do it again, kind of. And that's what clinched it for me. I was like, oh, okay. So this woman's, like, changed her identity, relocated herself before. Like, they're probably all the same person. And it actually made me really enjoy the story, I think, knowing, because you could sort of see through lines in the book, and like it makes the death of her son so much more brutal and heartbreaking when you like understand how they're all connected. And I feel like it makes more sense.
Yeah, because I feel like there's so much we don't know about Essen, especially because, which is the next thing I want to talk about, this sections with Essen are told to us in a second person. So as the reader, you're reading things like, you walk along the road. And K. Jemisin writes better sentences than that. But that's my example. That you are Essen. The pronoun you is used to address the reader who is being called Essen. So it's just interesting how that is done. And because it's written that way, and because Essen's so mysterious and there's things we can't know about her past, so that like the mystery still holds, I feel like I didn't have that much compassion or sympathy for Essen. Like I was concerned, I was curious what was happening in her life. But knowing that, when Essen's mourning the death of her son, this is Cyanite who's mourning the death of her like second son.
Yeah.
And like feeling like she's failed yet again. And like that hits even harder. And we learn at the very end, which before we turned on the mic, I was like, Julia, can you confirm something for me? Because I read the ending so fast. I was just like so jazzed to be at the end of the book and like just soaking it all in that I like forgot some very important details. Like we learn at the very end that the narrator who's addressing Essen as you is the stone eater called Hoa, and that just seems to like set off like the rest of the series of like, okay, so now we know who's addressing Essen, and has like weirdly a lot of insight into Essen's life and her future and like who she actually is. And we're like, what? So I thought it was a really interesting narrative choice to tell those sections in second person.
Yeah, because he's essentially telling her own story, because we learn eventually that there are these obelisks that hold stone eaters in them that sort of follow certain origins around. And so this one, Hoa, has had a connection to her whole life, I guess. And so then is telling her own story, but also about himself, which makes it kind of odd, because he also tries, he wants her to like him, and so he comes down to earth and makes himself look like a child so that she wants to take care of him, and he eats rocks, and you're just like, who is this kid? What the fuck is happening? And yeah, so that's a little odd. It feels strange to have this kind of ancient stone person telling you your own story, essentially, or Essen her own story. Maybe it's a little condescending, or it's do we like the Stone Eaters? They're ages and ages and ages old. They've probably got some agenda that's way beyond, the little petty survival squabbles of humans. Because if you're literally made of stone, they can pass through stone. They're completely unaffected by the volatility of the earth. So, what do they want? And why is he telling her story? Is this a good or bad connection? We don't know. And the fact that she doesn't get to tell her own story as well, I don't know.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I haven't read book 2 yet, and I'm really curious how the narrative approach is changed or what stays similar, because obviously the reveal is, we already have the reveal that Maya is Cyanite is Essen, and I don't imagine in book 2 we're going to go back and get random other stories from Demaya and Cyanite's portions. I think we're moving forward with Essen, and so I'm curious if we'll have multiple point of views moving forward, if we'll have Essen almost speaking for herself in a way, or told in third person, or will we continue to hear about her present day experiences in second person. I'm really curious how that goes moving forward, and what the heck is up with these stone eaters, because that just felt by the way, stone eaters almost the entire book, but we're so focused on figuring out the mystery of this character and how she's going to survive this fifth season. And we get to the end of the book and she ends up in this like underground crystal compound with a bunch of other origins and stone eaters and humans. And that's it. Like, we don't really get any sort of resolution except she found something for now, and it also doesn't seem like she can leave this place, question mark. And it's fascinating that we move through so much of the story, but obviously it's setting up a trilogy in a way that, like, there's still so much we don't know. There's still so much to come to have, like, some sort of conclusion to Essen's story.
I feel like this book, technically, we spend the most page time with the cyanide plot.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the one that does the most legwork in setting up the world, like the dark underbelly of the world, and Essen's history, you know, her past relationships, her past children, her past trauma, and setting up who Essen is so that we can then move forward with Essen from here as our main kind of protagonist. But yeah, so like her whole mission, Essen's whole mission is to find her daughter, which she doesn't. She picks up these two other weirdos who are like remnants of her past. So that it is interesting. There's technically no resolution in that storyline, but there is some resolution in the cyanide storyline because she's reconnected with Alabaster at the end. And we get the sense that like he's going to teach her stuff so that she can go and break the world some more. Because I love what he says to her. She's like, do you want me to fix everything? And he's like, no, that's not what I want you to do at all. I want you to make it worse. And you're just like, oh, here we go. Yeah, it's very much a first book where you're getting backstory and history and world building and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and then we get to move forward, but we're left with so many questions. Obviously, the Stone Eaters and the obelisks are apparently going to be super, super important because she can, like, kind of use them for power. And then the very last line is, have you ever heard of something called a moon? And I was like, hang on. So there used to be a moon? And then I went into this whole headcanon where I was like, wait. There was this story about how Father Earth didn't used to hate life, but then the people on the planet killed his only son. And then the earth became super volatile and started killing them. And I was like, did they break the moon? Is that what happened?
That is fascinating. I'm really curious.
Wouldn't that make sense, though? Like, if they broke the moon, that would really mess up, like, the poles and the ocean.
One of the fifth seasons of the past that they mentioned briefly, and it's also in the appendix, is that the pole shifted and, like, there was like a kind of a fifth season because like we didn't have the ash coverage in the same way, but like the pollinators and like the migratory birds and stuff like couldn't figure out where to go, and so there was like multiple years of famine before like the creatures kind of figured out how to.
Was that the season of teeth where they started eating origins?
It was the wandering season, which was before the founding of Sansa, so the history is like less known.
Yeah, because that would be moon related.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm just like, So then I was like, wait, is this like a post-global warming, like we broke the world kind of scenario, and then this is what's left thousands of years in the future? I don't know. There was this really long monologue in one of the interludes about how you need to pay attention to what's missing, and people don't pay attention to the sky and the celestial objects. And I was like, who cares?
Yeah, I thought that was about the obelisks. Because they become important later. But I think you're onto something there because, like, the obelisks are in the sky, but not as far up as, like, the celestial, stars and moon and whatnot. And also, like, it breaks my brain as, like, a little human stuck on our little planet Earth to be like, oh, yeah, they never mentioned a moon. I guess that means there potentially is not a moon there. Because I'm like, of course they have a moon. What does he mean, have you heard of the moon? It's like, they don't have a moon.
They don't have a moon.
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of digging into this world building stuff, and I want to like follow this into our next section. So when it comes to world building, Jemisin has introduced so much new terminology, new social structures, new technology. Like, this is a completely different world than the one we live in, but she writes it in a way, which all successful world building does, that the reader can track with it. Like, you can be a little human on a little rock called Earth, and you can read this book and you can understand it from the context around it, like we mentioned earlier in the episode, without just monologuing for a long time about the science behind everything. Like she
Yeah.
incorporates it and weaves it into these actual plot things that are happening, the actual character building that's happening, and we get the world building at the same time.
Yeah. There's some certain tricks that, like, good fantasy writers are very, very good at figuring out language learning techniques by essentially, they create new terms by either they mimic like the way that English grammar, mimicking the way English grammar works, or pulling from certain terminologies or types of terms that we're used to, but, essentially is suggesting a different type of slang. So, some examples. When we make adjectives, right? A lot of times an adjective is just a different form of a noun. Same thing with verbs, right? So you can think about love, lovely, loving, right? They all kind of have that same base. And so Jemisin does that as well, where you have origin, which is the noun to describe the person who moves the rocks, right? And then you have orogeny, which is the action of moving the rocks, right? So the way that they use those two words, you can see that they have the same base, and the way that they're used in the sentence, which part of speech they are. And so you can kind of make so origins practice orogeny, which is connected to the earth. Or you have Sansa, Sanzid, and Sansamat. So Sansa is the noun, it's the empire name. And then you have Sanzid, which is it's an adjective, right, to describe a person who's from Sansa. And then Sansamat is the name of their language, right? So you can easily make those connections. And then to cess is the verb of feeling around, which is very similar to a word we already have, right? To cess something out, right? So we already have that connection. For them, it's you're specifically cessing the earth. And it's connected to these specific organs in their brain stem. Essentially, they're special, kind of mirror neurons, I would assume, called sesapine, which help them sense the earth. And so that's to cess is the verb of that organism, right? And so you can make those connections really easily. And then something else she does is she'll have concepts that are similar to our own. So they have this concept called a use name, which is your job. Essentially, you're named after your job. So you can think about how we used to be named after our jobs, like a smith or a shepherd, right? And they have titles like strongbacks is one of the titles. We know what strongback means, right? So you can gather from context that, okay, so they name a person after their job, and strongbacks are probably hard laborers, right? Manual laborers. She pulls from certain things that we already know and puts it in context. So maybe you see some strongbacks building a wall, right? So you're okay, that sort of clinches it. Yeah, so and then curse words, a lot of times fantasy writers will make up their own curse words, and it's usually related. Yeah, they have a lot of fun with it. And it's usually related to the lore of the world. So in this case, their curse words are all related to lava and magma and the earth.
They'll be rusting earth. And
rusting earth, yes. Or under earth fires and stuff like that, right? So it's usually connected to the lore in some way. Or she'll just use an abbreviation for a word that we already know, right? So their cities are called communities, which is just shortened to comms. We know what a community is, and it has a wall around it. So we're okay, that's probably a city, and it's just called a comm, right? So then a comm-less person is someone who does not have a community, does not have a city. And you go from there. She does a really good job of it, and but that's some of the mechanics of how they help you understand things.
And I will add, in the print version, I know you had the audiobook, Julia, there is a wonderful appendix at the back. So there's an appendix of all of the different seasons and kind of cataloging some of the history that's mentioned. And then an appendix of terms, which gotta love it. I also just love when there's little Easter eggs back there in the appendix that don't get pulled into the actual book. You heard the term, but in the appendix you get to hear a little bit where the term originated in, because I love some etymology.
Yeah. I feel language does so much for creating a space. I feel that's where some of the best work gets done, because if you create a new term that no one uses on Earth, like in our world. This term is now specific to this place and immediately creates a separate place in your brain.
Yeah.
That, yeah, I think is really effective.
Another thing that I think works really well is that as Jemisin is building out this world, it's a lot of like, okay, here's the premise. This is the kind of world they live in. And these are their priorities as people, which is survival. And, there's this caste system in place. And there is definitely going to be people who are seen as more valuable or less valuable in this system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really fascinating that there are elements that come out because of this. So we have like the very obvious one of like the origins are oppressed because they are powerful, kind of magical, and they're called the stills, but humans who don't have that ability are rightfully afraid of them because an untrained origin can do a lot of damage and kill people and kill themselves on accident. And it's very emotion based, a lot of how the origin works. So you have this kind of hierarchy created in their world based on powers and abilities. But there's also elements that parallel our own world a little bit more that we can explore that are kind of interesting. So there's this racial discussion kind of throughout everything. There's people who are designated as breeders, and there are definitely certain body and beauty standards that are seen as really important in this world. And it's kind of noted when you're introduced to a character, you can get a sense of where they probably are from because of how they look. Or you can tell a person who is from maybe some blend of backgrounds because they have like elements that are Sanzid, which are more superior in this community, as well as elements maybe from an Arctic region or a coastal region. So I thought you made a really great note, Julia, here about like the beauty standards are different because it's about who can survive earthquakes and who is considered like powerful and like important in their world. So our American beauty standards of thin, maybe even like malnourished, pale people is like actually not very desirable at all.
No, because you will not survive.
Yes. Good luck.
There's this, in Essen's storyline, she comes to this community that's like underground that you were talking about that has a bunch of origins. And one of the women who seems to be in charge is like, Essen just goes on and on and on about how quote unquote undesirable or like unfit this woman is because she's so short and so skinny and so pale. She's just like a blonde woman. But it's just, she like re-emphasizes it every time we see this blonde woman who's like from the Arctic. Essen's like, oh, her parents probably didn't have enough food to feed her, and that's why she's so thin, or that's why she's so pale. And you're just like, it's funny to see kind of the mechanics of the way beauty standards get established, right? Because it always comes from class and power and all this kind of thing, right? So there's a lot of history in people's bodies. And it was really interesting because sometimes people write a fantasy and they're like, beauty standards no longer exist. You can make this character look like whatever you like. I'm just going to say they have curly hair and you can decide everything else about them. But in this book, it's like very important for the politics and the geography. And so she like gives, every time you meet a new person, you get a lot of detail about how they look and where they're probably from.
One thing she notes in the interview from Wire that we'll link in the show notes, there was like a question posed about like her approach towards writing a wide variety of sexual and gender identities in her characters. And I'm summarizing here, but basically she was talking about how like I created this world where there is oppression, there's this caste system of like who can do what jobs, there's like priorities of like who is more powerful and popular and like the beauty standards. Like there already is a structure, and she's like, I don't have to bring in this like very earthbound or Western culture issues around gender and sexuality. Like this world has other things they're focused on.
Yeah.
And that is just like something that's embraced and like understood. There seems to be still some discussion around gender identity because the one trans character does talk about how like basically they were failing their family. Like their family was like, you need to live up to these ideals. It didn't seem like their gender identity was like as much of the issue there.
It was part of it because they couldn't have a political marriage or something.
Yeah, they couldn't have a political marriage. So there's still some implications about gender identity. But yeah, we have queer characters, we have a polyamorous relationship, there's all these other elements that are just kind of like, yeah, that's part of who they are. And their society doesn't have the same oppression or discussion around sexuality that we do in our human earthbound Western
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah, it seems like gender and sexuality might be more of an issue if you're in the highest elite class, because that's where all the political marriages happen. It seems like that's where it's the biggest issue, but like, and every culture seems to have a slightly different, like, Cyanide seems kind of taken aback at first at the suggestion that they're like, why do we have to pick? We could just have all three of us. And she's like, whoa, wait a second. That's new for me. So like maybe that's not a common practice in the city that she's in, So like it seems like there are slightly different things in different places, but it's not like a huge deal. And it actually makes the fact that Alabaster's character is queer makes part of his story and their relationship much more interesting because not only is he being treated as like a prized cow breeder kind of thing, but also he's like not allowed to have the lovers that he actually wants. It's like an extra layer of...
Yeah, I guess there is that, like, whenever he talks about his former lovers, it's always kind of like with a side eye, like he doesn't say it necessarily, but like, oh, when I was traveling with this guy, kind of like, oh, we were obviously lovers. So there does seem to be maybe a bit of like censorship around what conversations are considered like open for him.
I'm not sure if that would apply to everyone, but it's like because of his specific place, they need him to make babies that are as powerful as him specifically. And one of his old lovers was like brutally murdered, so that probably has an impact.
Speaking of trauma,
in
this last portion of the episode, we wanted to talk about how fantasy novels, obviously, they can resonate with us as human readers, even if the world is so different, because the themes that are discussed are relatable. There's still an element, whether or not they're humans or not, that are the main characters. There's something relatable about these characters. There's a lot of themes we could talk about. There's themes of motherhood and femininity and power and politics and like the impact of being told a lie your whole life. Like there's like so many other themes we could talk about, but we wanted to focus in on the theme of oppression and trauma that comes up quite a bit in this book. So the dedication that Jemisin writes at the very beginning of the book is, quote, "For all those who have to fight for the respect that everyone else is given without question," which we find out later in the book is a very specific mention of basically how like the fulcrum, which is, I guess we haven't named the fulcrum. The fulcrum is where we train a bunch of these origins and kind of keep them under the hand of power of the guardians in the city. Kind of like the history behind that is kind of like, let's make them like think that they're getting respect by doing this thing, but actually we're still like holding all the power over them and they have to work really hard to be like seen as a human. So yeah, it's kind of like from the get-go, like that's who this book is for in many ways. I find it particularly useful and relevant that Jemisin worked for many years, including when she was writing this book, as a clinical psychologist. And I think she's able to write trauma in a way that is like believable and understandable, but also doesn't feel like trauma for shock value. It doesn't feel indulgent. It doesn't feel like we stay in these painful moments longer than is necessary to communicate what we need to know about this character for plot purposes. It doesn't feel like the trauma is a cheap trick to like trauma bond our characters or do something like really quickly just to like not have to write, how relationships developed, but they seem to be like a rich experience behind this. And in that Wired interview, Jemisin commented on this topic, and I thought it was really interesting to see her approach and maybe gives light into why this worked out, like why the writing of trauma is like done so well. She says, "I didn't set out to write big, heavy themes. I did not set out to write an allegory for slavery and caste oppression. I set out to write a story about a woman grieving her child. I set out to show what made her extraordinary. I set out to write a world in which people who are powerful, who are valuable, are channeled into systems of self-supported and externally imposed oppression, and how you can keep people who can throw mountains from throwing mountains and running the world." Oof. So I think that's a big piece that she didn't set up to be like, I'm going to write about trauma, but like, I'm going to write about this powerful woman. And she also mentioned in this interview that the very first idea for this novel came from a dream she had. She saw like a very powerful woman who looked angry enough to throw a mountain. And she's like, that's an interesting concept. What would it mean to throw a mountain? And so then ran with this incredible trilogy. And so I think understanding, okay, what would happen to this person to make them that powerful and that angry and that like badass, let's figure that out. And it feels like writing about the trauma and oppression they experienced is kind of like a way to start exploring those themes.
In a lot of ways, the way that orogeny is described sounds a lot like trauma because it comes from like their brainstem, you know, and it's emotion based and it's instinctive and it gets triggered to defend a person when they perceive a threat or get scared, right? So you can see how maybe it would have evolved from a need to protect yourself from earthquakes, right? That's a life-threatening thing. And there's a discussion about how, especially a child, an origin, who's maybe untrained, who isn't used to distinguishing between different types of threats, they respond to emotional and actual life-threatening threats the exact same way. They start an earthquake, you know what I mean? Or they attack in the exact same way regardless, which is so similar to how we talk about your fight, flight, or freeze response. Our body doesn't know the difference between an actual tiger and like an email, you know? Yeah, just a lot of the language around it seemed very similar to how therapists have talked about trauma. And I feel like you see that the best when they're sort of establishing the extremely abusive relationship of the guardians, who are the ones who actually have all the power. They control the origins. And so you see that in Demaya's storyline when she's young and she gets picked up by a guardian named Shafa. We don't know how to feel about him because she's threatened by him at first, but then he makes her feel comfortable because he's like saving her from her abusive mother. But then as they start traveling, you realize like he basically explains to her in not so many words, I love you. He tells her, I love you a lot, which is so messed up. Mm-hmm. And he says, I love you, so I have to hurt you. He literally breaks her hand to demonstrate it. I have to hurt you because you are dangerous and you are broken. There's something wrong with you, and so you need me to keep you in check and to fix you. It creates this really toxic, dependent, abusive relationship, which is like textbook emotional abuse. And there's a constant threat of physical abuse with that memory of her broken hand that never seems to come back until she's an adult and is actually discovering how messed up the world is and is trying to establish her own life, and she's finally breaking free. And then he comes back to her and he's like, I told you never to say no to me. And she has to fight so hard to say no to him. And she almost can't. She has to scream it because it's like so hard for her, because it's drilled into her that like he will even kill her if he thinks that it will keep everyone safe because he loves her. And it's like, woo.
It's real dark and messed up. Yeah, after reading the scene, like breaks her hand as a child, I had to like put the book down for a little bit. I was like, yeah, okay, gotta go take a breather. Yeah, that was like super intense. And it's also fascinating to see like a lot of the kind of internal frustration and anger that Cyanide maybe not even recognizes in herself until she's with Alabaster. And he's like basically deconstructing her world for her, which can probably feel very uncomfortable to have someone come in and be like, you're wrong. And like, that's the history you've been told, but it's a bunch of BS. Do you really think that's the way things are? And like asks like really needling questions that like obviously like don't feel good, but it's kind of like exposing her to, I don't know, opening her eyes in a way to the oppression she's living under, that she is accepted as like the way things are. Like when she first meets Alabaster, she's like a 4-ringer, which is their kind of like the rings are their levels of status and power and prestige as origins, and he's a 10-ringer, and she's like, fine, I'll like do this thing because it'll help me move up the ladder. And she's like really like gung-ho on the path towards the leadership and like being like the best of the best, and like then through her time with Alabaster and the events that unfold realize like I can't be a part of this anymore. And that's, you know, when she ultimately, big climactic moment, says no to her guardian, kills her son, and goes into exile and lives in secret. The scene where Cyanide kills her son, immediately my mind went to the story Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is based on the famous story of Margaret Garner, who was a slave who killed her child so that he wouldn't be, or the child wouldn't be captured. by slave catchers. And Jemisin does confirm that like that story was on her mind when writing that scene.
It felt very similar to that,
Yeah.
because it happens also in a similar position in the book. Ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
She actually comes to the realization later that her relationship with Alabaster drives her crazy and stirs up a lot of anger in her to kind of cover up for the fact that it makes her really scared, because he doesn't let her like hold on to the lies that have kept her safe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so like she's needed these lies and this belief that she can eventually move up the ladder and eventually be accepted, because otherwise she just can't deal with the very cruel reality that she's in, right? It's too much. And he's breaking that structure that's kept her safe her whole life. And that is extremely threatening. You know, sort of catalyst, eye-opening moments like that can feel like threats at first. You know, when you perceive new information that changes your worldview, that's like very hard to deal with, especially when it threatens your survival strategies, right? And I thought that was really well done. And he even knows it. He's like, you're not angry at me, you're angry at the world. But you take it out on me. And he's like, okay, that's fine, because I'm angry too. Something I really liked about part of her narrative structure that we didn't talk about is at the end of each chapter, there's like a quote from their stone lore or from their history, from the people in power. Like, you're not really getting the story of those people, but you're getting a kind of comparison of like the written history, what's actually written down, and then what the lives of people look like. And a lot of times they have to do with either the chapter you just read or the one that's coming next. And I'm pretty sure it's at the end of the chapter where he breaks Tamaya's hand. Or maybe it's the one where you learn about the nodes. Anyway, but there's this quote from one of the emperors of the Sansa Empire where he basically says, like, he's talking about origins. And he says, like, if you make them think that they have to earn the respect that everyone else is just given by nature of existing, if you make them think that they have to earn it, and then you set the price for that respect at perfection, they will wear themselves to exhaustion trying to earn that respect, trying to earn it. If you really make them believe that, they will spend all their time trying to reach perfection so that they can earn your respect. At a certain point, Cyanide realizes, like, the one 10 ringer she knows, Alabaster, is so messed up and so traumatized and so miserable. And also, he's still controlled by the system. And actually, you never are free trying to abide by the standards of perfection that they've set up. That quote, I feel like just summarized, it just knocked the wind out of me, because it just put into text kind of the subtext of so many social systems that oppress certain groups of people, where they make you think that if you just try enough, you can earn equality, you can earn respect that other people, privileged people, are given for free. I feel like that kind of summarized the whole book for me in a lot of ways. That Cyanide eventually gives that up, becomes Essen, and in the midst of the apocalypse is like, she's going to have to do something about it.
And that's where the book leaves off. And that's like, okay, let me go immediately download the audiobook for the next one, which I am, after hearing how much you enjoyed listening to the audiobook. I think I might listen in to book 2. So yes, speaking of recommendations, I would recommend reading the next 2 books in the series. Finish out the trilogy. That's what I'll be doing. Also, recently, I was introduced, or someone mentioned, Rebecca Rowanhorse, and I read the synopsis of her book, Black Sun, that looks super fascinating. So adding more, like, genre reading to my to-read list.
Yeah, I want to read everything that Jemisin's ever written, like, ever. I think that's my new project. And, yeah, I'm definitely going to listen to the next audiobook. This book also made me think of the YA series that starts with The Maze Runner by James Dashner. The rest of the trilogy, and there's a prequel, are, like, not that great. Like, but The Maze Runner is amazing. It's very, very good. But yeah, it feels similar in certain ways.
And finally, our currently obsessed portion of the episode, things that are bringing us joy. So I am currently in Colorado. I was previously in Denver, specifically, and I went to a brewery, I should say, Cerveceria Colorado, and I had probably one of the best beers of my life. It was so good. The atmosphere was really fun. It's a sister brewery of Denver Beer Co., which is like a bigger name. But Cerveceria Colorado is all like Mexican style beers. The bartender, the night we were there, was amazing. He was so fun, and he hosted a loteria, which is like, if you're familiar with bingo, there's some similarities, some crossovers. And it was funny. He was like making jokes, and the loteria cards were all like millennial themed. So it was like the squares were like El Man Bun and La Feminist. It was really cute and a good time. I also bought myself these really nice joggers because I recently got a leg tattoo and I needed some looser fit clothing while it was healing, and they're the softest thing ever. I got them from Athleta. They're just like gray and normal, but they're just so soft. And it's got pockets, so who doesn't love a good sweats with pockets?
Yeah.
And last thing, I'm all over the board today. I had an orange cinnamon cappuccino today from
What?
a coffee shop here in Colorado Springs. It was so good. It was like such like a subtle, it was almost like an orange essence more than any sort of orange flavoring on the front end, and then like cinnamon flavor on the back end. And I love a good cappuccino, so I was happy.
That sounds really good. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Tylenol and water and mint tea and the reader of this audiobook for getting me through this week of migraines. I have not done or seen or read anything else. Big ups to them for getting me through.
You made it.
I made it. Yeah. I'm excited. We definitely need to do the next book in this series.
Yeah.
Because we're definitely both going to read it.
I know. Yeah. Next season, let's start planning now.
Yeah, dude.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJB, on our website, bookclubwithjb.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.